So welcome everybody to this webinar, Learning from Bishop Hill, hosted by AIA Hong Kong chapter. My name is Faye, your moderator for tonight's event. We're very, very happy to have this event also supported by HK Icon and the Institute of Civil Engineers, Hong Kong Association. So besides Zoom, this is also available on Facebook Live. So if you have trouble logging into Zoom, then you might be just directly be thrown to the Facebook Live. And so if your friends are interested in this talk, but then they didn't get to register, then just please ask them to visit our Facebook page. If you're already watching this on Facebook Live and you want the learning units, which is worth 2 hours for this event, please leave your name and your AIA number as the comment in the Facebook Live. And throughout the event, you can use the Facebook Live comment box or the Q&A box in the Zoom toolbox to ask our guest questions, or if you have any comments, just feel free to let us know. So the Bishop Hill Reservoir has recently become the talk of the town. When the underground structure was exposed during the demolition, and with all the public attention, it just got into a state where it will be conserved in one way or the other. So tonight we would like to explore how we have learned from this Bishop Hill Reservoir incident and how we might improve the architectural conservation scene in Hong Kong by looking at other cities' experience. So tonight's first presentation will be made by Shita Lam, who discovered the site in 2017 when she was doing her research for thesis project for her master's degree in architecture. So she'll take us through her research with input from structural engineer Marc. Shita Lam holds a Bachelor in Architectural Study and also Master of Architecture and Master of Arts in Philosophy degrees from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And she's also a graduate member of the Hong Kong Institute of Architects. Whereas Marc is a chartered engineer with 20 years of experience and also a member of the Institution of Structural Engineers. So let's welcome Shita and Marc.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shita. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, that's nice. So hi, everyone, I'm Shita. So here's Marc.
Hi.
Yep. After the Bishop Hill Reservoir is discovered by the public, I continue my architectural research on this reservoir with people in different disciplines. So today we have Marc, a chartered structural engineer, with us. So thank you, AIA, for inviting me and Marc to this webinar and offer such a good platform for us to share our findings with you guys. So in the past few months, the discovery of the Century-Old Reservoir in Hong Kong has been widely reported. It aroused unprecedented public concerns and discussions towards the conservation policies and the future of a disused underground surface reservoir. So from this aerial photo, we can see the Bishop Hill is located to the north of the boundary streets, located right in the heart of the Kowloon Peninsula between Sam Shui Po, Prince Edward, Kowloon Town, and Shek Kee Mei. Besides the Bishop Hill surface reservoir, there are other similar surface reservoirs scattered in the Kowloon Peninsula as part of a water supply system, while also creating public void in the city. Unlike these cases, the above grade area of Bishop Hill was not open to the public for recreational purpose. Surrounded by the densely populated area, the local community turned Bishop Hill into a fascinating public space with strong identity. In the mountain, there are outdoor gym facilities, tennis table located in different zones, also pavilions for mahjong games, communal uses, and ghost worshipping. Communal gardens, self-built footpaths, and the outdoor furniture can be seen everywhere in the Bishop Hill Mountain. The summit area was also a party space in the past. And these facilities and elements are entirely built and managed by the local residents. this organic public space become a crucial part of the local community. Date back to 1960, the foot of the Bishop Hill was once a squatted and resettlement area. Considering the lack of public space in the district, the government official actually discussed the feasibility of developing the public space at the Bishop Hill in 1968. The plans were rejected due to the inefficiency in building things on such a steep slopes. So throughout the years, the local residents request the government to formally open up the summit area for recreational uses. So in 2017, the government finally decided to demolish the underground structure for future planning. So on 27 December 2020, the demolition work unearthed an underground structure by removing part of its roof and structural columns. The exposed the interior shocked the locals, and soon the locals realized the uniqueness of this underground structure and called a halt to the demolition. So this picture actually shows a lady who is a regular user of the Bishop Hill public space stopping the demolition work by standing in front of it in the morning of 28th of December. The discovery of these underground structures spread quickly through the social media. The public immediately crashed to see this rare building before it's gone. So on the same day, different individuals and then organizations immediately conduct and share their researches and the findings on the Bishop Hill Reservoir, which exposed its historical values and architectural significance. Those findings and the building photos spread quickly by the social media, and the people start to call for preservation of such rare structure in Hong Kong. And the voice of the people finally heard by the authority to halt the demolition plan. Without the social uproar, the crowdsourcing progress, and also the power of the social media, the result is very likely to be different. So I would love to show a video about the interior of this Century-Old Reservoir, so you guys can get a better understanding about the interior and the size of the reservoir first. So the plan diagram on the left actually indicates the dimensional portion and the structural arrangement of this underground structure. The reservoir is in circular form of cement concrete wall system. The total area is about 2,000 meters square, which is less compared to the figure given by the WSD, as the area of the mountain and slope are excluded in this figure. And there are 108 granite columns that are designed to support the roof, the red brick arches labeled 1 and the cement concrete vault labeled 2 form this arch and vault structure, which is able to transfer both vertical load and then lateral load down to the columns and then through the boundary perimeter wall. And the design of the reservoir is neoclassical architecture. The best known symbol is its arches and columns and the simple geometry. The design of the reservoir is not just based on aquatic concern, but the best form and structure in complying its function. So Marc would like to share about the structure of the Bishop Hill Reservoir with you guys.
Thanks, Shita. I will be presenting the structure of the Bishop Hill Reservoir, and later I'll be talking about some of the materials used for its construction. Shita has already given you a description of the reservoir, and now I'll provide more detail on the historic piece of infrastructure. This slide shows the overall structural and homes in on the key elements. Working from top down, the roof of the reservoir consists of a plain, i.e. no reinforcement, concrete barrel vault slab. Hopefully you can make out the arch in the soffit of the slab from the image top right of the slide. Beneath the roof, you'll find a series of parallel 18-inch thick brick arches constructed from engineering brick. And these are supported on a series of 24-inch by 18-inch granite columns. The columns extend down to a 12-inch thick plain concrete slab, which sits above the natural ground or strata, which in this case is likely to be rock. The perimeter of the reservoir is surrounded by a plain concrete wall, which provides a support to the outer structure and the lining of the tank. You can see a section through the wall on a drawing extract top left of this slide. Briefly coming back to the roof, the use of brick barrel vault floors was common around this time, but plain concrete barrel vault construction may be not so common. So perhaps the rarest part of this structure is the roof. The structure makes use of arch action in the barrel vault roof slab and brick construction to support all vertical loads. The arch geometry of the concrete and the brickwork shows these elements to span 3.5 meters and 3 meters, as shown on the images to the right of this slide. All horizontal forces are resolved internally within the concrete and the brick construction, and this prevents horizontal loads being transferred to the granite columns, which carry all vertical loads to the base slab and strata below. This slide gives a basic geographical representation of the structural actions and load transfers, but we won't go into these in any detail in this presentation. In its complete form, the structure is able to maintain compression in the arch systems and confinement through a combination of the back-to-back arches and the perimeter wall to prevent lateral movements. In this state, the structure is in equilibrium and stable. The break in the roof slab and removal of a number of the structural elements caused by the recent demolition works, unfortunately, has led to a loss of confinement, and as a result, the structure is now prone to movement. The movement could lead to instabilities. The structure is also now partly exposed, and therefore thermal loads may become an issue, and these may only exacerbate the potential structural movement problems. The diagram shown to the bottom of this slide shows the location and extent of the opening in the roof slab. This opening has caused a break in the structural continuity, and locally the internal forces are no longer in equilibrium. However, there is some good news. From the recent photos, the circa 116-year-old structure looks to be in great condition if we ignore the partly demolished section, and if works are undertaken to either reinstate or introduce replacement structure to prevent structural movement and deterioration, then there is no reason why this structure cannot be around for decades to come.
So here are two drawings about the reservoir, one in 1907 and one in 1952. The one in 1952 was drawn by the government for the repair works carried out in the same year. The circular form, a circular earth-filling portion was built to reduce the water capacity and the water level. However, discrepancies were found between the drawings and the as-built conditions. Therefore, a new documentation for an accurate understanding and detailed revitalization scheme in the future would be needed. So the size of the Bishop Hill Reservoir actually is larger than the two standard basketball courts. It's a scale comparison between the Bishop Hill Reservoir and the Basilica System in Istanbul and the Paddington Reservoir in Sydney. The size of the Bishop Hill Reservoir is similar to the Paddington case, which the later one is converted into an urban garden in 2006. So here is the timeline and the history of the Bishop Hill Reservoir. It was designed in 1900 as a part of the Kowloon Waterworks gravitation scheme. Its constructions commenced in 1903 and completed in 1904. It served our community until 1970s. So what are the significance of this century-old reservoir? Firstly, is its contribution to the early urbanization of Kowloon. The reservoir is located in the New Kowloon area, which was ceded to the British government in 1898. However, then, the southern Kowloon was a military base having a population of 40,000 only. In the photos, we can see how the southern Kowloon looks like in 1860s. After the British government gained control over the entire Kowloon area, it started to turn Kowloon from villages into a modern city. The boundary streets actually mark the distinction between the southern Kowloon and the New Kowloon area, projected a huge population growth Hence, the demands towards a clean water, a new water supply system is required. Before a centralized water supply system was established, the Kowloon people actually relied on the well water and spring water. The quality of the water varies as there is no monitoring system. To tackle the increasing population and improve the public health in southern Kowloon, the first generation of water supply system was proposed by Chadwick in 1890 and completed in 1895, 1 year before the outbreak of the plague in Hong Kong. The water supply system in 1890s used the groundwater from the wells at Ho Man Tin as the major source. The water was pumped into the surface reservoir in Yau Ma Tei and Hong Kong through the Yau Ma Tei pumping station. After the 1898, projected a huge population growth for the future city and the needs to further develop and improve the public health, a new water supply network was in need. Consider the topographic features of the Legoland. There are lots of mountainscape compared to that of southern Kowloon. Therefore, the Kowloon Waterworks Cohabitation Scheme is proposed by the directors of Public Works, Mr. Lawrence Gibbs, in 1900. He proposed to build the Bishop Hill surface reservoir with the Kowloon storage reservoir to change the main source of water supply from the groundwater to capture water. The new system actually is connected to the supply network of the first generation waterworks system. Since the Kowloon storage reservoir is located at a higher level, the water will automatically flow to the lower place without the use of the pump. The reservoir previously built in Hong Kong, like the Pho Lam and the Dai Town Reservoir, also apply the same water distribution method. People use gravity and a reservoir for water supply system for 1,000 years already. Similar modern gravitational scheme can also be found in Taiwan and Japan. As mentioned, the Bishop Hill Reservoir was decided together with the Kowloon Storage Reservoir to provide 519,000 gallons of water to the community per day. The Bishop Hill Surface Reservoir helped to release the air pressure in the pipes and also to adjust the water pressure before it reached the locals. It witnessed the transformation of the water supply system and contributed a lot in the early urbanization progress of Kowloon. The historical value of Bishop Hill should be considered and evaluated as a group with the Kowloon Storage Reservoir. In 2009, 5 historical structures of Kowloon Storage Reservoir was declared a monument already. The Bishop Hill Reservoir is indeed a mixed heritage, considering its group value with the Kowloon Storage Reservoir. And through the in the study of the water supply network, it's found that the Yau Ma Tei Surface Reservoir, which belongs to the first generation of water supply system in Kowloon, is disused and not yet graded at the moment. Back to the architectural significance, the arch and vault structure of Bishop Hill is a very traditional Western technology. These 2 cases are the underground system with similar structure built in the 1st century in Italy. However, the Bishop Hill Reservoir is much more than just a simple transplant of Western architecture in Hong Kong. Its materials reflect the local and the Asian modern history, and more importantly, mark the transitional periods between the traditional and the modern architecture in Hong Kong. The use of the arch and vault for underground structure could be dated back to ancient Greek and ancient Egypt. The Romans further developed the technology and then bring it up to the ground, and finally became one of the well-known features of the Roman architecture. However, the Bishop Hill Reservoir is not directly related to Romans or Greeks. Before the 20th century, the bricks and the stone were the major materials in constructions. The first building that adopted the cement concrete in Hong Kong is the Dai Town Reservoir, completed in 1888. And the use of the reinforced concrete structure in Hong Kong actually happened in the 1910s. Compare the reservoir completed in the same period of time in Hong Kong, it's found that most of them are constructed in bricks and stone only. The Bishop Hill Reservoir should be one of the first generation concrete buildings in Hong Kong. And one point to note here is the Bishop Hill Reservoir adopted the cement concrete of 1:2:4 ratio, which should be designed to comply with the building ordinance established in the 1903. In a wider perspective, the red bricks constructions actually reflects the modern world and the ancient history. Affected by the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, the red bricks become popular again since the mass production helped to reduce the cost and improve the quality. The Bishop Hill arch structure adopts the Flemish bond, which is first appeared in the Western world in the late 17th century, and it was widely adopted on the government and domestic buildings. In other Asian areas like Taiwan, Singapore, Japan, red bricks architecture can be found due to the Western power entered Asia in the late 19th century. Closer to home, the red bricks was a common materials of Hong Kong colonial architecture in the Edwardian period, such as the Western Market and the Hong Kong Museum of Medical Science. So Marc would like to talk about more about the materials with you guys.
Thanks, Shita. In the next couple of slides, I will look at the materials used for the construction of the reservoir, starting with the bricks. The brick arches are constructed of engineering brick or red brick, a common building material used in many parts of the world during this period. Before the mid-1800s, Hong Kong would have imported bricks along with many other building materials. However, this approach was not sustainable until the end of the 1800s. Hong Kong started to establish its own large-scale construction materials manufacturing plants. One of these facilities was the Hong Kong Brick and Cement Company Limited, which was established in 1886 and manufactured bricks and clay piping on their site in Deepwater Bay until the 1930s. The Deepwater Bay plant is mentioned in an advert dated in 1897, which can be seen on this slide in the bottom left-hand corner. And above, there are some photos taken in 2018 on Deepwater Bay Beach, showing bricks bearing the initials DWB, Deepwater Bay, HKB, the Hong Kong Brick Company, and GIC, Green Island Cement Company, which bought the Deepwater Bay site in 1896. So it may be possible that we could confirm the place of manufacture of the bricks used at the Bishop Hill site by looking within the demolition rubble. Hopefully some of these bricks will have similar markings. Moving on to the granite stone columns. From the CEDD geological maps, it can be seen that the Bishop Hill site is located in an area of Kowloon granite. An extract from these maps is shown on the bottom right of this slide. The pink areas show where Kowloon granite is found, and Bishop Hill is marked to the southwest of Point 4. From this information, it's very possible that the granite columns were constructed from stone cut from the reservoir excavation. And lastly, on the materials, cement and concrete production. Hong Kong imported cement up until the establishment of more local, large-scale cement manufacturing plants around the end of the 1800s. Records show that the earliest of these plants were the Green Island Cement Company in Macau, established in 1887, and the Hong Kong Brick and Cement Company in Deepwater Bay, as discussed previously. Shortly after the establishment of the Macau plant, the Green Island Cement Company constructed a cement works adjacent to Kowloon Harbour near Hop Yun, which opened in 1898/99. This facility went on to produce up to 8,000 tons of cement per month to meet the local demand, and they started to export cement to Singapore and Southeast Asia. So if we look at the timelines, it's very possible that the Bishop Hill Reservoir was constructed from materials wholly sourced and manufactured in Hong Kong. Back to you, Shita. Thanks.
Yeah, and based on the latest finding on other pre-war reservoirs in Hong Kong, like the Yau Ma Tei and the peak areas, we can see the Bishop Hill Reservoir is the only reservoir which is in circular form and composite of granite, bricks, and the cement concrete. So what are the difficulties in revitalization in the architect's point of view? Actually, the building authorities has the power to exempt government buildings from the restrictions of building ordinance. But if the building is given to other parties, such as NGO and then the private developers, it will be very difficult for the reservoir to comply with modern building codes and utilize the surrounding land as a part of the design. Because when we look into the feasibilities of the Bishop Hill Reservoir, it could be very difficult. It could be very different with other revitalization projects in Hong Kong. For the heritage standing in the city, our intervention is limited to its own building lots. Necessary intervention and the new program have to be inserted directly inside the building. For example, is the cistern in Barcelona. They converted it into a library and inserted amenities like the elevator, staircases within the existing grid so that the library can comply with logistic requirements. And this is the case in Sydney. The cistern is located at a wall junction. They convert the cistern into an urban park. Half of the roof was opened up to create the second courtyard and for necessary access point. But this case is more feasible as we could utilize the surrounding as a part of the revitalization scheme for different amenities and supporting facilities so that the original architecture elements could be preserved and the future buildings could still be functional. A wider scale of design to improve the entire accessibilities of the reservoir and convert the building into a comprehensive master planning is also possible, provided that the ownership problem is solved. But even the building is under the ownership of the government, the structural safety, fire safety, and accessibility are things we cannot allot as an architect because we have to ensure the public safety under all foreseeable circumstances. So is our sharing so today. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marc and Shita, for your sharing. So now we have a better idea of what the Bishop Hill Reservoir incident is. And maybe the next question we would all have is, how does this reservoir fit into or misfit into the Hong Kong heritage architecture conservation framework? So up next, we'll have Fredo Cheung to explain to us what is the current Hong Kong heritage conservation framework like. And so Mr. Fredo Cheung is the Vice President of the Hong Kong Institute of Architectural Conservationists. And upon completion of his study in the Hong Kong Year Architectural Conservation Program, he began to develop a portfolio of projects as a heritage consultant. And right now, he divides his time between teaching and pursuing his PhD. So let's welcome Fredo.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Bishop Hill from the perspective of heritage conservation. So let me see. So this gives you a brief outline of my presentation. So in the first part, I'll talk about the how we go about conserving built heritage. So the conservation process. I also talk about the value-based assessment of heritage places, how we go about determining the significance of a heritage place. And then in the fourth part, I'll go into detail about the heritage assessment mechanism in Hong Kong, and then offer some of my my observations based on the Bishop Hill incident. So when we talk about conserving built heritage, who should really decide and how? That's the first question we should really be asking. And so when posed with that question, I would usually say that it's the stakeholders who should decide. But of course, with expert advice from qualified conservation professionals after consultation with stakeholders. So really, it's about the local community. So how do we actually go about doing heritage conservation? Well, there's actually such a thing as a conservation process. So I think for most countries with a very well-established heritage conservation history, they would have this conservation process in place. And one of those countries would be Australia. So looking at the Australian example by James Kerr, the conservation plan, he's actually summarized the conservation process in two stages. The first stage being understanding the place. What's important about that place? Why does it need to be conserved? Stage 2 is about conservation policy and implementation. So what are the policies which are needed to conserve the heritage place, and how can it be implemented? And of course, if you look at, let's say, each of the stages in detail. So when we talk about understanding the heritage place in stage 1, what we're really talking about is 3 distinct steps. The first step being gathering evidence, documentation, and also physical field studies, and also doing desktop research. And to a certain extent, Shita and Marc's presentation has already given us some insight into step 1. And then step 2 is about coordinating and analyzing the evidence. And as we get to step 3, it's summarizing everything that's there in step 1 and step 2, and which is assessing and stating the significance of the heritage place. So this would entail the writing of, or the drafting of, the statement of significance. And once this is completed and we have a thorough understanding of the significance of the heritage place, this is when we talk about developing conservation policy and how we go about implementing such policies to ensure proper conservation of the heritage place. So this would involve, step 4, gathering information for development of conservation policy. So it's really gathering the required professional expertise, form of engineers, architects, surveyors, and possibly also the end user, all working with the conservation consultant to come up with the policies. And of course, it has to be said that throughout stage 1 and stage 2, it's important to actually engage the stakeholder as well, which is the local community. And so as we get to stage 5, it's then that we actually develop the conservation policy itself and also the strategies. And step 6 is about stating conservation policies, evolving strategies, and options for its implementation plan. So in many ways, this two-stage process is actually universally accepted. So when we talk about the heritage conservation process, most countries would actually have something that's similar. And we can actually look at the Canadian example. So if you look at the Canadian example, it's slightly different. So instead of a 2-stage process, you have a 4-stage process. So one which entails about understanding the historic place, A, and B, we have evaluate significance, and C, assess potential impacts, and D, develop conservation strategies. But if you actually look into the detail, you'll see that it's actually quite similar to the Australian process. So again, stage A and B is essentially identical to stage 1 of the Australian conservation process. So it's about understanding significance. And stage 2 is actually about policy and implementation of such policies. But what I like about the Canadian process is that you can actually distill the entire process in 4 key questions, which is stated on the right-hand side of the slide. So essentially it's talking about, what is it? What is this heritage place? Why is it so important? What is going to happen to it? And what are we going to do about it? So with the Bishop Hill Surface Reservoir, we are really still at this stage, understanding what it is, and also why it is important. And so which is why it's important for us to actually, at this stage, to understand why it is important. So in other words, if we're actually looking at the conservation process, we're actually right here. We need to evaluate its significance, understanding heritage values, the character defining elements, and finally coming up with a statement of significance. So when we talk about evaluating significance, we're really talking about understanding its cultural heritage values. So what are heritage values? So simply said, heritage values are the basis for assessing significance of a heritage place. So we put it in layman's terms, it helps to explain why the place is such a big deal and why it warrants conservation. And looking at different internationally, different international charters, you can see how these values change over time. So when we look at some of the earliest documents, such as the Venice Charter by the International Council of Monuments and Sites, ICMOS, the heritage values are mainly focused on the historical, aesthetic, and archaeological. So again, you can see that it's mostly focused on historical and the aesthetics. Whereas as we get to 1979 with Australia ICMOS's Bureau Charter, the focus on values changed to include social aspect. And this is actually quite important, as I'll go through later. So what's important about the Bureau Charter is that it now not only meant, the heritage values are no longer focused just on the historic and aesthetics, but also the social values. Well, in addition to also the scientific and spiritual values as well. And this really marked a shift in how we look at heritage values. So as we move further down to, let's say, the Parks Canada in 2003, again, you see at least 6 different values which have been identified, but the common denominator is always with the historic, aesthetics, and social. Same can be said with China ICMOS's China Principles, 2002. And also English Heritage, now Historic England's Conservation Principles, where they essentially identify historic, aesthetic, and communal. So in fact, you can see that nowadays when we talk about heritage values, most common heritage values are the historical, architectural, and social. So when we talk about historical values, it is really talking about the history of the place, its past, its associations with important historical figures, events. And as we talk about architectural values, self-explanatory, it's the aesthetics, design value. So it's really about the physical aspect of the place, the tangible. And also the place should be an outstanding example of a particular architectural design, an artistic achievement, or an outstanding expression of important architectural ideas. And possibly it could be the rare or the last example of its kind. But when we talk about historical values and architectural values, these are really traditional values. So they're really grounded in the past. Whereas social values is different. It's about the community. It's about people's values. So it is about the connection of a place to people in the present. So the intangible and the living. So how does the place actually connect to people in the present? So in other words, social value is a contemporary value. And I would say that in terms of, let's say, local heritage, contemporary values such as social value is probably the most important value when we look at these heritage places in Hong Kong, especially Bishop Hill Reservoir. So this change in focus in terms of values is actually mirrored in, let's say, the local historic building assessment criteria in Hong Kong as well. So if you look at the AMO's criteria for grading historic buildings, from 2002 to 2008, the criteria pretty much focused on mostly historical values and architectural values. Whereas in 2008, it changed to the point where we actually have social value and local interest, which is contemporary value. So you can see that in many ways, the development of the historic building assessment criteria in Hong Kong also mirrors this kind of change in perception when we talk about heritage values. So now we understand what heritage values are. Then how do we go about understanding significance of a heritage place? Why is it so important? So this is where after we actually understand the heritage values of a place, we have to draft a statement of significance. So what is a statement of significance? So it's basically an assessment of the special qualities or characteristics which make it important, which makes the place important for conservation. So the typical structure of a statement of significance comprised of two parts. So the first part being understanding the place. So basically providing background information on the place, from a historical, architectural, and social background. And the second part is about assessing the heritage place. So the actual statement of significance, which includes a short description of the place, to help a person who's not familiar with the place to have a visual picture of what the place is like. So it establishes the heritage values of the place. Again, the three common values which we just talked about. And then it identifies the character defining elements for each of the place. So these are the tangible and intangible elements which should be conserved. And it should also state how these CDEs, or character defining elements, should be protected. So at this stage, what is the significance of the Bishop Hill Surface Reservoir? I mean, Shita's and Marc's presentations has already given us a lot of insight. And with the information which they have provided, let's make an attempt at actually establishing the significance of Bishop Hill Surface Reservoir. So if I was actually to summarize the statements to the significance of the Bishop Hill Surface Reservoir, I would say that, first of all, it is an integral part of the historic Kowloon Waterworks gravitational scheme, the Kowloon Reservoir system. So it is a highly significant piece of infrastructure, which basically paved the way for development of Kowloon Peninsula. Secondly, its unique construction is actually a testament to the ingenuity of late 19th century, early 20th century engineering, where we see the experimental use of concrete, which was considered a relatively new material in the local industry at the time. Thirdly, when we look at Bishop Hill Reservoir and the Kowloon Reservoir, it's important that we not forget that it's actually a lasting testament to the skills and craftsmanship of the local stonemasons, a trade which has long since been in decline and with most of the skills and craftsmanship already lost over time. And finally, for almost 50 years, Bishop Hill and the former Surface Reservoir actually served as a very important communal recreational space for the Shep Kip Mei residents. So it's actually a highly significant public space for the local community. So having established the significance of the Bishop Hill Reservoir, and also having an understanding of how the conservation process works and how we assess heritage, let's take a look at the assessment mechanism in Hong Kong, and how we actually go about, how AAB and AMO go about assessing heritage. For starters, let's take a look at how heritage actually fits into the Hong Kong development framework. So you can see from this diagram that at the bottom you have the Commissioner for Heritage, CHO, and of course down here you have AMO. So the way this is set up, heritage is now considered part of the development framework, so it is actually under the Development Bureau. And the Antiquities Advisory Board at the periphery offers advice to the Secretary for Development and also to the Antiquities and Monuments Office. So what does this mean? Zooming in further. So basically the Commissioner of Heritage's office, CHO, their role is that of policy. Their role actually entails the interface of development and conservation at policy level, implement, monitor policy on heritage conservation, and also devising new initiatives on heritage conservation. As for AMO, they're really about implementation of the policies. So identifying, recording, research on buildings and items of historical interest, maintaining and developing archives of heritage sites, the actual protection, restoration, and maintenance of monuments, assessing and evaluating impact of development projects on heritage sites, advising on the adaptive reuse of suitable historical buildings, and also fostering awareness of Hong Kong heritage. As for AAB, as the name implies, their role is advisory. And so they basically advise the Antiquities Authority on declared monuments, proposed monuments, and graded buildings. And they also advise the Antiquities Authority on heritage conservation policy. And by antiquity authorities, we're really talking about the Secretary for Development. So what are the types of heritage we have in Hong Kong? So basically, we only have declared monuments and graded buildings. The declared monuments are of the highest significance, and these are really the structures and also the heritage assets which are actually accorded with statutory protection. As for graded buildings, they're not actually accorded with any form of statutory protection. So when we talk about a heritage grading system, this is how it's actually broken down in Hong Kong. So in some ways, it's actually quite similar to the UK system. So it's a numerical system where grade 1 is actually the highest when it comes to significance. So when we talk about grade 1, we're actually talking about buildings of outstanding merit. And so every effort should be made to preserve it. As for grade 2, they're buildings again of special merit. And maybe some selective effort should be made to preserve it. As for grade 3, we're talking about buildings of some merit. So preservation in some form would be desirable. But it's actually hard to visualize the degree of intervention which is allowed for these different structures. So depending on the grading. So why not let's take a look at the examples below. So the one on furthest left is actually the Blue House. So that's a grade 1 historical building. The one in the middle, the former Elliott Pumping Station Senior Staff Quarters. This one's a Grade 2 historical building. And on far right, we have the Wan Chai Market, which is a Grade 3 historical building. So there you go. So you can see that with Grade 3, there is actually a greater degree of intervention, which is possible. Whereas in Grade 1 and 2, the changes are not as obvious. They're much more limited. Of course, if you actually take a look at our heritage grading system, the first thing which stands out is that it's focused mostly on buildings, and which is why I highlighted the word buildings. And this brings us to the first issue when we talk about the current Hong Kong Heritage Assessment Framework. It's focused on buildings or architecture. In many ways, this is actually quite archaic because most of the jurisdictions around the world have diversified heritage conservation to encompass other types of heritage, such as archaeological sites, design landscapes, battlefields, and even movable heritage, such as transportation. And yet, in Hong Kong, we're still focused on buildings. And as we zoom in and take a look at how we go about doing the heritage grading itself, the process is actually can be described as a two-tiered process. So the assessment is always conducted by the Antiquities Advisory Board at the behest of the AMO. So the stage one would actually involve the AAB members filling out the historical building assessment form, which provides a member with a set of criteria and a scoring system to quantify significance. So in the diagram on the right, you'll see what the criteria are. And then stage two, after the assessment form has been filled out, the scores will then be reviewed. And then there will be a comparative rating of the buildings, which will be carried out and based on 3 parameters. So the historical, the typological, and the contextual. Now, I won't go into detail with the stage 2 because I'll be mostly focused on the assessment itself. So I'll focus on stage 1 at this point. So when we actually look at the assessment form itself, the criteria, so you can see how heritage values actually fit in. So you can see, of course, the architectural matter, which is about architectural values. And of course, social values. And then, of course, also the first one, historical values. But you will also note that the way the criteria are written, there seems to be a focus on architecture itself. So for example, if you look at even group values, the importance of, let's say, building cluster is of harmonious architectural design and style of Hong Kong, or an integral component of an historical complex. So again, even when we talk about its value as a group, it's about architecture. So which is why I said that it's more of an architectural value. As for social value, if you look at the first bullet point, it says the importance as a symbolic or visual landmark recognized by the community. Now again, visual landmark. Again, focus is about the visceral. So it's about architectural design. And of course, if we get to the last point about rarity, again, it's an architectural value. And this, of course, brings us to two other issues. So, which is basically on the focus on buildings. So the criteria actually places emphasis on aesthetics and style. And also the criterion of group value is also primarily focused on aesthetics, as opposed to function. Now, this is actually quite problematic from the context of, let's say, the Bishop Hill Service Reservoir, because knowing that it is actually part of the Kowloon Reservoir system, its significance lies not so much in its architecture, but rather that it's actually a piece of infrastructure, a piece of engineering. So looking at how AMO actually went about grading the Kowloon Reservoir system, well, back in January 2020, they announced that 5 of the historic structures on the Kowloon Reservoir are now declared monuments. Now, if they've actually went about it systematically, the assessment process, appreciating the fact that it is a piece of infrastructure, then they would not have missed this, the Bishop Hill Service Reservoir. If you look at the 5 examples on top, you can actually see the contrast. It's this fixation on aesthetics, on the tangible, without actually appreciating the fact that it is a piece of infrastructure, not architecture. That in some ways has actually caused the Bishop Hill Reservoir, Service Reservoir, to be missed out in the original January 2020 assessment. So this may possibly explain why it got left out in the original assessment. And then if we are to actually look into how we classify our heritage assets. So what you see here is actually a list of the 34 heritage typologies, which have been identified by the Antiquities and Monuments Office and the AAB. So this is actually extracted from the AAB minutes from 2009. So you can see that the typological classification is all framed under notion of historic building types. But again, this is problematic because, as you can see, certain types don't actually fit into the classification of buildings per se. Cemetery and graves, commemorative stones, plaques, inscriptions, and also waterworks, which is really infrastructure. So if we are actually to summarize how the heritage grading process in Hong Kong, how we go about actually the assessment of heritage typologies in Hong Kong, we can basically say that it's a one-size-fits-all solution. So it's a single set of criteria and guidelines for assessing all heritage types. And this actually contrasts sharply with what other heritage conservation jurisdictions in the world will approach, let's say, the grading process. So if we're to actually look at an example in the UK. So in UK example with Historic England, they will have specific listing guidelines for different heritage typologies. In fact, they're very meticulous about the classification of these heritage typologies. And then they will have these tailor-made listing or grading guidelines for each of these heritage typologies. And notice that one of them would actually be infrastructure, utilities and communication. So which is basically what Kowloon Reservoir would be if we have something similar. So if we look at historic England, they actually have 44 sets of selection criteria listing guidelines, 20 of which are about buildings, different building types, which, as I said, includes infrastructure, utilities, and communication. And there's also another one in infrastructure for transport. And of course, more diverse elements such as street furniture. And then there are another 18 which are focused on design landscapes. There's even one on battlefields and one for ships and boats. And this brings us to the two other issues. So the problem of one-size-fits-all approach is that it's basically using a single set of criteria. And that single set of criteria was actually devised in turn to assess only buildings. While some of the typologies listed in classification do not conform to the statutory definition or the building construction industry definition of what constitutes a building. And which also explains why some of these heritage assets cannot be graded. For a third point, it's about infrastructure versus architecture. It has to be realized that waterworks cannot be assessed on the grounds of architectural aesthetics only, due to its nature as a piece of civil engineering works. And when we talk about infrastructure, it is most often systemic in nature. So its significance really stems from the entirety of the system itself and not as independent structure. So certainly when we are actually looking at the Bishop Hill Service Reservoir, its significance lies not in itself as an independent structure, but rather because it is part of the Kowloon Reservoir system. So to conclude, I would say that the Bishop Hill incident has actually shed light on the urgent need for a specific set of guidelines for grading infrastructure heritage, which can really address the systemic complexity of infrastructure heritage, and also to provide guidance to AAB members on how to approach the assessment of infrastructure heritage in a systematic way. And then zooming on a macro context, there's also an urgent need to revamp the current heritage assessment framework to provide typologically specific grading guidelines. And of course, there's also a need to involve practitioners who are actually well-versed in heritage conservation. So this concludes my talk.
Thank you very much, Fredo. So now we learned that the Hong Kong Heritage Conservation System doesn't really, it's really not the most suitable for grading infrastructure like water system, like the Bishop Hill Reservoir. So are there other cities or countries doing better on this topic? Do they have a better assessment system than Hong Kong do, and how do they carry that out? So up next, we're very happy to have Ms. Jennifer Lang to share with us her experience working on U.S. heritage conservation. So Ms. Jennifer Lang is the current director of Hong Kong Youth Conservation Program. She is also the immediate past president of the Hong Kong Icon and also the vice president now. And she has more than 30 years of experience in the field of heritage conservation in the U.S. And We are very glad to have her to share with us her knowledge and experience on water system heritage evaluation and conservation. So let's welcome Jennifer.
Thank you. Just one moment here while I share my screen. Oops. Sorry, I'm having some problems here. Can you see the screen?
No, not yet. We just see the
I'm sorry,
file name. Yeah.
I'm having problems. Okay, now can you see it? Yes?
Yes. Now we
Okay.
can see it. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much, Faye, for the introduction. So tonight I'm going to be speaking about understanding how historic water conveyance systems are evaluated for significance in the United States. I'm going to be starting with a quote from a former colleague of mine, Amisha Hunter Burkett from New York City. And she states, historic waterworks, including aqueducts and sewers, are civil engineering achievements with unique heritage management challenges. Often designed to be silent and unseen, the subgrade and inaudible infrastructure that delivers water and removes waste is frequently ignored by the public unless it stops working. Although these systems can benefit from official designation as heritage, they are infrequently given this benefit, as the water and wastewater management community that is responsible for them often remains disconnected from the heritage management community. So what is water infrastructure heritage? It is a type of civil infrastructure that can be defined as the skeletal and vascular framework that supports social, economic, and cultural life in modern civilization. These systems include subgrade components such as pipes, mains, conduits, weirs, cisterns, and underground, as well as above ground components such as gatehouses, aqueducts, arcades, spillways, reservoirs, pressure equalizing towers, and bridges. These systems are frequently linear by design. A linear relationship can be found between point A, which might be a dam, and point B, which could be a reservoir, as well as interconnective components such as conduits located between these points. Most of the drinking and wastewater infrastructure we rely on is silent and unseen. And it's difficult for the general public and others to value water infrastructure that is physically concealed, publicly inaccessible, or silent by design. Therefore, often it is above ground systems such as reservoirs, spillways, and bridges that are most easily observed, inventoried, and given heritage protection, and the underground elements such as water tunnels that are less frequently seen and less often inventoried and protected. So just very briefly, I want to talk about what the derivation of public water systems in the United States are. So safe drinking water and wastewater disposal facilities are not new to our civilization. As was mentioned previously, they date back thousands of years, beginning with the Romans, who invented engineering systems such as aqueducts and canals to import water. In the United States, between 1800 and 1860, all major cities in the United States as far west as Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans built urban waterworks systems installed with new technologies. And by the late mid to late 19th century, there was growing recognition that water was a vehicle for the spread of diseases such as typhoid and cholera. Wells and springs within cities easily became contaminated, and unfortunately, the link between contaminated water and waterborne pathogens and diseases was not well known. Additionally, there was a need for water in cities to provide water for fighting fires. And in the United States, initially private water companies supplied waters to city, but soon these systems became public. So it's also interesting to note that there are, in the United States, some aesthetic changes that can be seen in water conveyance systems between the 19th and the 20th century. So in general, you could say that the architectural design of waterworks structures in the 19th century, engineers and civic and business leaders relied upon the aesthetic vision of architects to give visual form to waterworks structures. And these waterworks designs conform to the architectural design standards for their time and place. But in the 20th century, we began to see a change, and dams and aqueducts, canals, and waterworks buildings began to demonstrate a more minimalist aesthetic. And by the end of the 20th century, they began to disappear and take on the quality of low horizontal relief in design and were placed underground. So I want to first begin by talking about two prominent systems, one from the 19th century and one from the 20th century. So the first system I wanted to talk about is the Croton Aqueduct in New York City. The aqueduct was built in response to fires and epidemics that repeatedly devastated New York City, owing in part to its inadequate water supply and the contaminated wells. The Croton Aqueduct was New York City's first municipal water supply project and is an outstanding example of 19th century civil engineering. Constructed between 1837 and 1842, the aqueduct provided New York City with its first planned water supply system and served as a model for many other cities. The 8.5-foot tall masonry line conduit ran 40 miles through topography north of Manhattan in Westchester County to deliver water to Manhattan. In a few places, the conduit tunneled through solid rock or was carried across valleys on bridges and berms, yet most of the aqueduct lies on a stone foundation immediately below ground. And here you can see a profile and ground plan of a portion, the lower portion of the Croton Aqueduct in the 1880s. And this is showing the bottom part of the aqueduct in New York City. An interesting part of the Croton Aqueduct is a place called Highbridge, which is a crossing over the Harlem River. This was originally completed in 1848, and it consisted of 16 individual stone arches. By 1928, the five of those stone arches that spanned the Harlem River were replaced by a single 450-foot long steel arch. The bridge was closed to all traffic from the 1970s until its recent restoration, and it opened to pedestrians in 2015. The Highbridge consisted not only of the bridge itself, but also a reservoir and a tower, which you can see here in the distance. And here are some drawings of the Highbridge. And these are photographs of what it looks like today. So what is the influence, or what was the influence of the Croton Aqueduct? It delivered adequate and reliable supplies of potable water to New York City residents and reduced outbreaks of disease and fire. It also dramatically improved domestic hygiene and changed interior design of buildings in New York City, with bathrooms and running water becoming more commonplace. And it was an outstanding example of early 19th century civil engineering, which became a model for water systems in other cities in the US, thus helping to create the modern city. So moving on to another prominent example on the other coast, I'd like to talk about the Los Angeles Aqueduct for a few moments. This is a water conveyance system that was built and operated by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. The Los Angeles city planners looked 230 miles away from the city for a water source on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, and they bought water rights and land at the Owens River, Owens Valley. The aqueduct channels water from the Owens River through canals, pipes, and tunnels until it emerges into the San Fernando Valley, close to Los Angeles. Construction of this system began in 1908 and was divided into 11 divisions, including a cement plant. And the first aqueduct was finished, in 1913. Like the Croton Aqueduct, the Los Angeles Aqueduct uses gravity alone to move the water and water to generate electricity, and it remains in operation today. The aqueduct is a modern utilitarian design for a long distance and large scale water system. It originally consisted of 6 storage reservoirs and 215 miles of conduit. It was subsequently added to. And the system comprised 24 miles of open unlined canal, 37 miles of lined open canal, 97 miles of covered concrete conduit, 43 miles of concrete tunnels, 12 miles of railroad track, 2 hydroelectric power plants, 3 cement plants, 170 miles of power lines, 240 miles of telephone lines, and 500 miles of road. It's quite a system. Later, the system was extended with the construction of the Mono extension and the second Los Angeles Aqueduct. Here you can see some section drawings of the open line canal sections and also a part of the covered conduit sections. So the Los Angeles Aqueduct was not, or is not, without its controversy. The construction of it eliminated the possibility of Owens Valley becoming a viable farming community, and it very significantly and negatively affected the ecosystem in the Owens Valley. There remains today a very significant dust issue and that dust problem in that area. Many legal battles ensued, and there are a number of books and movies on this topic. And rivalry between Northern and Southern California, this is a good representation of it, representing competition for urban dominance, political battles, and the discontinuity between Southern population centers and Northern water supplies. What was the influence of the aqueduct in Los Angeles and on the Los Angeles County? Between 1909 and 1928, the city grew from 61 square miles to 440 square miles with a population of 800,000. And today, Los Angeles covers 465 square miles with a population of 4 million. 4,000 workers labored using new technologies such as the Caterpillar tractor and setting records for the number of miles tunneled and pipe cut. The aqueduct would supply Los Angeles with enough water for millions of people and thereby enable the explosive growth that would characterize the region for decades to come. And this also included creating reliable irrigation for farms and ranches and facilitated the growth of suburbs and industrial centers in the Los Angeles basin. The aqueduct is a monument to modern technology. It's a uniform geometry and complex system of canals, siphons, tunnels, gates, and other control structures that represents the work of engineers. And at the time that it was constructed, it was one of the largest in the Western United States. And it became a symbol to represent struggle for control of water in the arid West. And here are some, I think, very prominent photographs taken showing the portions of the aqueduct under construction. And you can see in the left-hand photograph the snow-covered Sierra Nevada mountains on the left photograph. So looking at how water conveyance systems and historic properties are evaluated in the United States, you have to understand that the system that's used there is called the National Register of Historic Places, or NRHP. And this is the United States government's official list of district sites, buildings, structures, and objects that are deemed worthy of preservation for their historical significance. The passage of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966 established the National Register and the process for adding properties to it. So how do you evaluate significance using the National Register Historic Places system? So for the purposes of this system, resources are classified as either buildings, sites, districts, structures, or objects. And water conveyance system elements fall into the structure classification. So in order to, for a resource to become, to be put on the National Register list, the resource must meet one or more of the National Register criteria, and additionally, it must retain integrity. So the 4 criteria are A, to be associated with events that have made a significant contribution to broad patterns of history, B, to be associated with the lives of persons significant, C, to embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction or represent the work of a master, or D, have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. So using the National Register system, there are professional qualifications that are outlined in the Secretary of the Interior's professional qualification standards. And these provide guidelines for determining who is appropriate to professionally evaluate such resources. A site or property is evaluated for significance, and it may be either found to be eligible or ineligible. And a field inspection and recordation document the site's location, the physical characteristics, significance, and its integrity. It's important to note that research must include, in addition to basic information such as alignment and key elements of potential significance, related associated resources, dates of construction, alterations, and period of operation in order to obtain the property's period of significance, historic context, and integrity assessment. Another important point is evaluation should apply to an entire system, and consideration must be given to all potential areas of significance and should be examined in relation to contextual themes in application of the National Register criteria and in assessing integrity. I think I just went over this. So, National Register evaluation criteria for water conveyance systems. Mostly when evaluating water conveyance systems, these systems are commonly can be found eligible for criterion A for their association with important events, or criterion C for their engineering or design value. But a system has to be adequately documented through accepted means of research as being associated with an important event. Speculative association cannot offer eligibility, and the system's association with the important event must also be an important association, not mere coexistence. For criterion C, related to engineering or design value, there are examples of different types, periods, or methods of construction. And properties listed under this criterion may have unique values, or they may be the best or good examples of a type of property. For example, the earliest, best preserved, largest, or sole surviving example of particular types of water conveyance systems, or a property that introduced a design innovation may be eligible as examples of evolutionary trends in engineering. And as I mentioned before, integrity is an important part of the evaluation process. And water conveyance systems that appear to meet the National Register criteria must also retain integrity. And this relates to the ability of a property to convey its significance. And in order to do this, the property has to possess usually all of these qualifications relating to integrity, location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So there are two types of documentation that are required for surveys of water conveyance systems. They are inventory records and survey reports. And this is a inventory and survey checklist that gives you a sense of the types of inventory and survey that would be carried out when doing a water conveyance system evaluation. What are the different or typical components and features of water delivery systems? There are basically 5 different components. There are diversion structures, conduits, flow control devices, cleansing devices, and associated resources and settings. So I'm just going to show you some photographs of some examples. This is a photograph of some diversion structures. Here's a photograph of a conduit example. More conduit examples, a tunnel and a flume. And some pipelines. Flow control example, spillway and an intake, a cleansing device. This is a trash gate. And associated resource settings. There are habitation sites, mines, hydroelectric power plants, agricultural landscapes, and telecommunications and power lines and access roads. So here's examples of a powerhouse and electric transmission lines. These are all examples from the Los Angeles Aqueduct system. And here are some other examples of one of the cement plants for the Los Angeles Aqueduct systems. So I'm nearing the end. I wanted to tell you about one specific example that I worked on. Before I moved to Hong Kong, I worked for an environmental consulting firm in California, and I spent a lot of time evaluating water conveyance systems. One of the systems that I evaluated was the Killer Cow Creek hydroelectric facility, which was being decommissioned. It is located in Shasta County in northern California near the Oregon border. These are some photographs of parts of the system. So in 2009, I was part of a team that was tasked with evaluating this hydroelectric system for decommissioning. And so the purpose was to identify and record archaeological resources, to identify and record and evaluate architectural resources, and make recommendations for avoiding impacts to all potentially eligible resources. So we evaluated these resources for National Register and also for local California Register eligibility. The system consisted of 2 powerhouses, canals, dams, ditch tender cabins, bridges, flumes, siphons, tunnels, spillways, berms, a forebay, and a penstock. So a total of 11 cultural resources were identified, and all were recorded and mapped and photographed. Based on the record searches and extensive archival research and field surveys and the resource evaluations, 2 resources were deemed eligible for National Register and California Register eligibility. And these are photographs of the 2 powerhouses that we found to be eligible. And they were found to be eligible under criterion A for their association with the development of hydroelectric power production in Shasta County in the early 1900s, and also under criterion C for their architecture workmanship, for their industrial style and resemblance to German barn forms and stone masonry materials that represented important and rare examples of local building practices for industrial buildings during the first decade of the 20th century in Northern California. We also evaluated the whole system as a whole, but it did not maintain enough physical integrity to be considered eligible as an historic district under criteria A and C. So because too many changes had been made to the system. So we did not recommend that the system was eligible, just the 2 powerhouses. And here are just some examples of the forms that I mentioned before that you're required to complete and then send to the central place where everything is kept on record. So you take photographs, you do drawings, it's a complicated system. So what recommendations could on how this could be applied to Hong Kong's historic resource systems? I have a few points here. So first, what should be evaluated? It's important to confirm that historic water conveyance system components align with the evaluation resource type or classification system. And this directly speaks to what Fredo was mentioning in his talk. Water conveyance systems include structures designed to move water from one place to another and are frequently part of a larger system and should be evaluated only by consideration of the entire system. So the second important point is that a whole system has to be evaluated. You can't just pick and choose the parts that are visible or the parts that look like they might be prettiest. Okay, what is the significance? How to establish the values and character defining elements of historic water systems. Water conveyance systems can be found significant for their engineering or design value. However, beyond this, these systems delivered water that facilitated other activities, and thus their importance must be understood in relation to broader developments. This is in line with the Getty's new publication, the 20th Century Historic Thematic Framework, theme number 1, regarding rapid urbanization and growth of large cities, including the increase of city size, population and density, and increasing scale and range of infrastructure needs such as water systems. And again, this is relates to both of the previous talks that you heard tonight. So that concludes my talk tonight.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much. Very, very informative. So now that we've heard a little bit about the background of, well, not a little bit, very thorough background of the Bishop Hill Reservoir, we kind of learned about the Hong Kong Heritage Conservation Framework. And we also have heard about how the US is dealing with water system heritage conservation. So in the next session, we have 3 amazing guests joining us for a discussion session. So first of all, we have John Miminas dialing in from London. So he's an architectural designer with more than 18 years of experience in heritage conservation. And currently he is working mostly on repairing historical churches in London. So let's welcome John. Hi, John.
Hi there, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here, Faye. Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So when we talk about conservation, it's really not just the work of architects or just the work of the government. It really takes the collaboration between different disciplines. So when we talk about a water system, of course, we have to hear from the civil engineers, right? So tonight we have the honor of having Mr. Lee Chi-Ming joining us. So Mr. Lee worked in the water supply department for 32 years. Wow. So he was the head of design division, overseeing the design and construction of projects of worth more than 4 billion Hong Kong dollars. And Mr. Lee was also the chairman of the Institute of Civil Engineers, Hong Kong Association, from 2013 to 2015. So let's welcome Mr. Lee.
Hi, everybody.
All right. So last but not least, we also have Professor Ho Pui Peng. Oh my God, this is a very long title. So Professor Ho is the current UNESCO Chair on Architectural Heritage Conservation and Management in Asia. And he's also the head of Department of Architecture, School of Design and Environment, National University of Singapore. And prior to that, Professor Ho is also the Professor of Architecture and Director of the School of Architecture and University Dean of Students at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Professor Ho has been a conservation consultant, architect, and advisor on more than 100 conservation projects in Hong Kong and Singapore since 2003, including the PMQ and Court of Final Appeal and the new campus for Chicago University Booth School, and all of which are in Hong Kong. Let's welcome Professor Ho. Hi, Professor Ho, you're muted.
Hi.
Maybe we're running into some technical issues now. So let's dive into the discussion right now, and while we help Professor Ho resolve the IT issue. So we have received a few questions. Oh, hi, Professor Ho, you're back.
Yes, I'm back.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah.
So my first question is for Mr. Lee and Professor Ho, because both of you are very knowledgeable on the built environment conservation in Hong Kong. So what is your take on the Bishop Hill Reservoir incident? And for John, after learning about this Bishop Hill incident in Hong Kong, what's your thought on it? And before you guys answer this, all the audience, you're welcome to type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom bar. And then we'll read out the questions to the guests and speakers. So maybe let's start with Professor Ho.
Oh, thank you, Faith. I think the incidents definitely is one that awakened public interest in conservation of heritage in Hong Kong. I think that's a very key component. We are, by and large, since the Queen's Pier incidents in 2006 and 2007, the Hong Kong public has already been they are awakened, or they are very interested in historic monuments, in historic architecture. And there are many groups in Hong Kong in the past to perhaps put forward the protection of buildings in Hong Kong. And many times, some of the groups have done really great research. And so, such as this one here in the Bishop's Hill Reservoir, we can also see not only the interest of the general public, not only the interest of people who use the place for morning exercises, but also professionals, but also not related to the AMO, to the government, to AAB, but they are very interested, and they also provided a lot of professional and very detailed account as well as a study like Shita. So you have a whole generations of Hong Kong people who are energized for public as a public with interest in historic heritage. I think that is a very, very important point. The second point, of course, is that there are mistakes committed by several parties in this particular incident, and I think it will be really important to look into the gaps in our system and see how we can plug the gap and really make our system of protecting heritage for our future generations more robust and more efficient, as well as answering to the view of the public. Yeah, maybe CM can continue.
Thank, thank you, Professor Ho. I fully agree with you that definitely this is a mistake committed by the administration. I think, unlike in many other cases, that the Bishop Hill Reservoir has been brought up to the government, to AMO, but they have been negligent in not inspecting it and evaluating it. It's good that we have a group of enthusiastic citizens who stand out and make the issue public, and then we are able now to preserve it. But the lesson we learn is that definitely we have to think about, not when we have talked about heritage, it's not just about the kind of look it from the outside, its beauty. We have to also look at it from the function. When we take into, for example, like you can example, there are a lot of infrastructure like the fourth bridge and many water supply systems that have been well kept and preserved, and actually it's also been used. They have also been used as kind of education for education of public on how infrastructure has transformed the nature and how it transformed our life. I think this is a lesson we should learn. The point from now on is that how you are going to make use of Bishop Hill and the nearby Kowloon Group reservoirs to bring people's attention to how infrastructure, particularly water supply structure, has transformed Hong Kong in the early days. I think that maybe when we think about a film about Bishop Hill in the future, we should focus on this issue.
Yeah, just to carry on from our two distinguished speakers, the presentations today were just simply amazing. I turned back to first turn to Shita and Marc's presentation and the most captivating image that I had, for me anyway, was that picture of Miss Lee, kind of just taking control of the situation, and kind of, you know, I think without the presence of her there and possibly her photographer, we might not have too much to refer to except maybe the drawings. So I think, and there's a comment in the chat about what is the role of public engagement in conservation, and I think in terms of the Hong Kong framework that Fredo has detailed out, I think more of that needs to be kind of emphasized, and more roots in to maybe even, because obviously, you know, if I turn back to Miss Lee, she circumvented all of the process of the AAB and AMO. She did it all on her own, I would say, in one very physical statement. So and she's brought that issue to prominence with it, at least in Hong Kong. And I found out through it from a Hong Kongese friend, which is nice to see, that it was stopped in record time. It'll be an adventure now to see how the project is developed. Sorry, all of a sudden, London is getting sun. It'll be an adventure to see how it all pans out. I mean, there are really good precedents that Shita has referred to in Barcelona and things, but perhaps, you know, turning back a little bit and helping to classify, categorize, get all that information together, make a robust case for why this is important for Hong Kong, maybe the community. And you might find that if you start expanding out of the kind of circular disc of the cistern, you might find that the park is also that critical asset just for that community, and you might be able to build to more emphasize that group value, that it isn't just the building, as Fredo was mentioned, that it is something more about that landscape that is a really key feature that adds to the community and is an amenity to the surrounding neighborhood.
So we also have received quite a few questions from the audience. And so one from Jim. So his question is like this: from Jennifer's presentation, we learned that compared to other cities like New York or LA, Hong Kong has far less number of statutorily protected buildings by proportion. So maybe Professor Ho, how is Hong Kong's heritage conservation work compared to other cities in Asia? Perhaps like in Singapore, Taiwan, or Tokyo? Are we like really behind as compared to other Asian cities?
I think it's very difficult to make that kind of comparison across a wide geographical region with different cultures, different societal makeup, as well as different pace of development. Hong Kong had been developed pretty early, I would say, like in the 70s and 80s, when great areas of say shop houses and in the middle of the town and have been demolished and so on. And so it has been moving in a very fast pace in the 70s and 80s, and resulting with the destructions of many of our heritage. Like what we see, say today in Singapore, where we had still a lot of shop houses, more than 7,000 shop houses and tenement houses remaining being protected. So in that regards, I think Hong Kong really is so unfortunate that historically it had been going through this process. If we look at, say, Yangon in Myanmar, which has preserved a lot of urban central sort of heritage, now recognized as heritage, and before they were not recognized as heritage, and undergoing a lot of changes right now, with many buildings being used for adaptive reuse. I think we can only say that they are fortunate to have not developed that early, so that many of the historic buildings can be preserved. But I think over the last 10, 15 years, Hong Kong had developed a system of heritage recognition, has allowed a really great public and the public awareness about the values of heritage buildings, not least because of the ACP program at HKU for the last 20 years, helping to raise the awareness and equip and also really educate journalists and other people in Hong Kong about the value of our own heritage. I think that whole process had been really, in the last 15 years, I must say, have been really quite astonishing in raising the awareness of heritage and conservation in Hong Kong. The other comparable example would be Taiwan, where a lot of efforts have been done, both in the public, both not necessarily by the professional, but a lot of bottom-up efforts have been going on in Taiwan about conservation. And that, I think, for example, in contrast, Singapore and other Southeast Asian countries basically lacking the bottom-up efforts in conservation of heritage buildings. So that's a very broad, sort of broad brush painting of what we can see in this part of Asia.
Thank you, Professor Ho. So we've received two questions from the audience. Both of them are associated with public engagement. So, Winston and this audience with last name Chu both ask about this. So where do you see the public's role in heritage preservation, specifically in Hong Kong? In today's heritage grading process, how is the public's interest represented? Maybe Fredo can answer this.
Okay, I think when we talk about public participation, I think that is actually the most important aspect with, let's say, heritage conservation in Hong Kong. And when it comes to civic engagement, I mean, usually when you talk to government officials, they would usually say that the best channel for the public when it comes to, let's say, talk about heritage is to actually write to AAB and AMO. So if you have a complaint, just write. So for most members of the public, that is probably their only way of communicating with the government when it comes to issues pertaining to heritage conservation. And in many ways, this is not actually ideal, because I would say that many of the residents don't actually know that this is the way to actually go about it. In fact, many would actually, on the district level, they would actually approach the district councillor, such as the case in the Bishop Hill incident. The reason why the necessary action was taken was because the resident actually informed the local district councillor, who then in turn called the AMO, and which explains why the demolition work stopped right away because of that phone call. So this also explains why, even with this is the kind of community participation we're talking about in Hong Kong. And when it comes to policy, we do actually have a policy review when it comes to heritage conservation. But the last one which we had was back in 2014, which is some time ago. So again, maybe this is time for us to actually look into possibly another policy review. And we're certainly due for one.
Maybe the same question could also go to Jennifer. In your experience compared to the US, how do the public engagement get weaved into the heritage conservation policy in the US? Like I believe it's not always like Hong Kong, like Bishop Hill, where a lady in red will have to stand in front of a bulldozer to stop it, or write a long letter to the AMO, right? What are the ways to deal with this in the US?
Well, sometimes it does take, an event, someone stepping in front of a bulldozer to get attention, and there have been some pivotal events like that in the US. So, for instance, when Pennsylvania Station was demolished, a number of prominent architects and civic leaders and even celebrities like Jackie Kennedy, they protested, they marched, and it actually was as a result of the demolition of Pennsylvania Station that the New York City Landmarks Law came into existence. So there is a role, and an important role, for public advocacy in conservation. I think that role needs to be more embraced. So I would say, to follow up on what Fredo just said very tactfully, that in Hong Kong, the way that people can communicate their feelings about conservation is by writing letters. I would like to see that at some point that could be increased, and maybe there could be more transparency, there could be more opportunities for the public to actually be more directly involved by attending meetings, maybe speaking at meetings, because in my experience, there's more of a process like that in the United States. But maybe that's not ever going to happen here. I don't know.
But if you look at, let's say, I think the heritage conservation policy in Hong Kong and how it has evolved in recent years, most of the changes actually came about because of advocacy. So without the Star Ferry incident and Queen's Pier incident, there would not have been these fundamental changes, such as embracing social values when it comes to a heritage-based or actually a value-based assessment of our heritage. And of course, conservation for the longest time in Hong Kong was actually seen as an impediment to development. But because of the Star Ferry incident and also the Queen's Pier incident, this has fundamentally changed the perception of the government, where now conservation is actually seen as part of development. So all these changes in heritage conservation policy came about because of advocacy.
Well, I have a different view about Bishop Hill from Queen's Pier. In my view, I think Bishop Hill is a kind of administrative failure, because the issue has been brought up to AMO and then they failed to do the job. It's very unlike Queen's Pier, because like Bishop Hill, there's no urgent need for demolishing it, for building anything. The whole idea about demolishing the Bishop Hill was to make way for a place for playground for the public, and the issue has been brought up. So that this reflects there is a kind of a system we have to not just talking about the kind of grading, but we also have to try to look into the kind of the bureaucracy, because what people just I have been a government official. I know that I look quite well at how the system works. Like the commissioner for heritage, it's not the person who is passionate about the job. He's actually been appointed to do the job. Well, he may be a good administrator, but he lacks the kind of experience and the kind of spirit and the heart to do the job well. And this is something we have to rethink about, how we are going to revamp the whole system about heritage grading. I mean, in many places, in many I would say more developed societies, they have a kind of the power is reverted to the public. The public has a kind of a decision-making power on how you're going to do the heritage grading and things so on. But that's not the case in Hong Kong. We have to think about the kind of how we're going to look into it and revamping it. I know the Hong Kong government is still a kind of I have to say it's the 70s, 80s thinking. They are afraid of reverting the kind of power to the public, no matter what the power is. And we have to, but I know under the current political climate, it may be very different. But it's something we have to think about when we're talking about heritage.
And I think one point I would like to supplement is the public role in the Bishop Hill case is very special, except the social resistance part and also the crowdsourcing process. This the AMO and the WSC can only confirm the Bishop Hill Reservoir was built was a pre-war buildings before the historical documents was disclosed by the public in December. So I think actually, so it could be like become a blueprint for the future assessment, because it discloses actually the abilities of the government officials. Actually, they should open up the whole things and then to allow more public to involve in the assessments, rather than just creating the assessment for themselves, and then so no one can proofread their things and then see the loopholes in it. Yeah. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, Bishop Hill is indeed a very unique experience or incident in Hong Kong's history, because within 48 hours, we got the drawings. We got the technical research about how this reservoir works with the rest of the Kowloon water system. We got VR video, virtual reality, a video of the reservoir already shown on YouTube. We got numerous proposals of how this reservoir could be preserved and activated. It's all done in 48 hours with a petition as well. So this kind of crowdsourcing of information, of passion accumulated from the public is really amazing and should really be put to good use. Now, our next question is about, let me see, the financial viability or stability of how this, let me see, the financial sustainability. How could financial sustainability be achieved in conserving Bishop Hill Reservoir while there are so many regulations and serious scarcity of land supply in Hong Kong? And perhaps an associated question is also the blame of structurally unsafe is often used to describe certain monument or historical structure, and then it became an excuse or a way to just like, why not just demolish it? And so these are kind of two related questions. What are the ways to achieve financial sustainability? And how do we structurally reinforce, or is it possible to structurally reinforce this kind of historical structure? What kind of cautious do we have to take? Like maybe Marc, you can start with the structure part, and then perhaps Professor Ho, you have such rich experience in conservation project and activation, in this kind of conservation project in Hong Kong. Maybe you can talk about how roughly the financial is being done. So Marc?
The speaker, the speaker. Oh, there we go.
Hi, Faye. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Faye? I apologize.
So our audience, Jack Choi, mentioned that it could be easy or convenient to condemn a historical structure to be structurally unsafe to modern standards, just like the Bishop Hill. And that could provide a green light for demolition. So do you think such public safety concern is valid? And it seems to be like, are there other ways to reinforce these structures?
Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, the site is secure. You can't get into the site, so the public is safe from this building. So that's the first point, which is the right thing, because effectively it is an active construction site, so the public should not be in there. So that's fine. But I can only talk about what I've seen in terms of the images that I've seen. But as I said in my brief presentation, it looks like the structure is in great condition. The elements at the interface with the demolition, there's some issues which need to be resolved very soon. That we need to get some temporary works in there, and we need to make sure that this building is not going to move any further, because it will have moved. Because as I tried to explain with my presentation, the confinement, what I mean by is the back-to-back arches and the slab is keeping everything together. And if you take part of that away, then there's going to be a relaxation in that structure. And that area that's been affected is now probably, I would say almost definitely, moving. So we just need to stop the thing from moving. If we can do that, I think the structure can become safe very quickly. Beyond that, we're into what do we do? I don't know. Personally, I'd like to see it rebuilt. I know that's difficult, but there are skills in Hong Kong and around the rest of the world that could easily rebuild this structure. And then perhaps after it's rebuilt or made safe or perhaps altered, then all these other issues about the land ownership, what we're going to do with the site, the financial issues, which are all valid, but they can be decided by whoever they need to be talked amongst, and whoever needs to make that decision gives them time to make that decision. But at the same time, we've protected that structure and we've protected that heritage. And that's what I believe we should try to concentrate on in the short term. I hope that answers your question, Faye.
Yep. About financial sustainability, that's a very tough question in a city like Hong Kong that relies mainly on real estate development. And with a shortage of land for housing, I think that's an increasing sort of challenge to Hong Kong. My sense is that in the last decade, Hong Kong has developed into, like what I said previously, that the value of heritage have been sort of recognized, and more people, albeit perhaps not the landowners or property owners, are beginning to realize the need to preserve heritage for identity, for our posterity, and therefore the financial questions would have to take account of this social assessment. We often look at it purely from real estate point of view. Purely from a real estate point of view. And I think from now on, we have to develop a system of assessing the financial implication of a preservation or conservation project from both perhaps the real estate, the land values, as well as the social value. And how do we judge the social value in terms of economic terms? How do we judge the environmental value in economic terms? When we look at some of the buildings, I'm really quite sad that AIA building had been under demolition or reconstruction or whatever. But the embodied carbon that is in there had to be taken into account. And so some of this economic and environmental values, as well as their costs, has to be factored into the redevelopment of sites by demolishing of historic buildings. So we have to develop that. I think Hong Kong should develop that aspect of calculation in terms of financial values.
Maybe John can supplement a little bit on this topic. How is London does the evaluation system in the UK have accounting for the few different values besides a monetary value that Professor Ho just mentioned, like social value, like the carbon footprint? Is that part of the UK evaluation system?
That's an interesting question. I think it is a sort of a robust evaluation system that the UK uses. When you're talking about financial viability, I mean, I'm working on a ruin at the moment in a park, not too dissimilar than the situation, but it's a much smaller project. What is the financial sustainability about bringing essentially a ruin back to a useful building, which currently doesn't have a roof or floors, and part of that seeks to, it's owned by the government, but they are doing a partnership arrangements so that they've managed to get an idea. I mean, it's a very small building, so they were looking at integrating a cafe into this building, so that there would be more footfall coming in, more supporting that building in terms of upkeep, and then also locating a community use in there so that the building would remain active essentially at all times of the day. So there is a sort of a backstory that has to underpin whatever you're sort of putting together as a heritage development. So yes, I would say that it does factor in. And in terms of economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, it's always in the back of our minds that we have a rich built heritage. We've already invested, as Professor Ho's raised, the investment of carbon into those buildings, the building trades, and to support those trades which exist to conserve those buildings and keep those people employed. I think that also factors into what we're doing, and that spreads across a rich sector of spectrum of heritage assets, whether it's churches or whether it's a Georgian terrace or whether it's a music hall. I mean, it keeps people active in the field of conservation, hands-on, real hands-on work. So I think that's important as well.
Moving on to the next question from our audience. So this audience asks if we have some pre-conservation methods for possible underground heritage to avoid some destruction under new construction in the city. Maybe I want to tag along my own question as well. So has there been like any overall Hong Kong survey on both buildings and infrastructure, especially water system, besides the current, like before you build a building, there has to be an environmental assessment being done. So maybe CM can help answer my question first about this overall survey, and then maybe would Fredo or Professor Ho want to answer the second part, which is about the environmental assessment report done before you have any excavation or new construction?
Well, I would say Hong Kong is a relatively young city, and all our major water supply systems are well documented. Well, maybe what you need, if you really need it, we just need to do some kind of management, or just take it out and sorting out. But it's very easy. All the records are there. All the records are in the water supplies department, well recorded, all the engineering drawings, when it was built with what kind of materials. And particularly for reservoirs, we are very concerned about the safety of the reservoirs, and that's why we adopt the kind of system in UK. We have a reservoir engineer coming over to inspect all the dams, all the reservoirs, including surface reservoirs like the Bishop Hill, at regular intervals. So I don't think the chance that we are going to damage any of the underground water system, I think no other water system is very slim, and I don't think it's possible. Yeah, but of course, apart from the the water supply system, there are a lot of other underground structures like the tunnels for air race, where we have a lot in the cities. I think this I don't know whether this system. I do think that these systems are well recorded, but maybe we also can do some kind of work to find it out and list it out and think how we are going to do with it. Just like, for example, like I think there's one such tunnel is being used as a wine cellar, wine storage. I think even a restaurant, I've been there, is very interesting, but I don't know how the kind of usage, how you're going to make it more more attractive to the public, more public can go and enjoy. That may be something we should consider.
Okay.
Fredo, do you want to say also? I mean, during 1995 to about 2000, early 2000, there had been a territorial-wide survey, and that turned out surveying buildings pre-1950s. And I think I was part of one group of surveys, and we did about altogether in the whole of Hong Kong, 8,800 buildings have been identified pre-1950s. But as Fredo said, at that time, our focus is on building above ground, nothing underground, nothing, not the tunnel, not the area shelters, and so on. So, for example, in recent years, Mao On San's tunnel or the whole mining system had also been identified as a site for our sort of heritage assessment, and so there are many such sites that had escaped the survey to some extent. So there's this wide territory-wide surveys, and so some buildings have been identified, and I'm advocating to do another survey for modernist buildings. So from 1950 to 1980, for that 30 years, and I think that should be done so that we can save quite a lot of modernist architecture in Hong Kong.
Do you want to clarify on the EIA issue? Okay, I think for most people, and I think you'll probably be aware that I think when it comes to heritage buildings, certain projects are required to undergo the Heritage Impact Assessment (HIA). But of course, HIA is actually part of the EIA, which is the Environmental Impact Assessment. However, not all projects are required to actually undergo an EIA, unless, of course, it's a government project, or specifically government projects which are funded through the Capital Works Fund. So that actually excludes a lot of our heritage buildings, which are under private ownership. So they are not actually required to do the EIA or undergo, or also the HIA. So that is actually part of the problem.
Maybe, Fredo, if there was a way to pull that out of the EIA and just have it as a requirement for heritage buildings, those buildings that have been identified, that could be a useful a way to approach it.
Yeah, that would be ideal, and also that maybe the HIA should be applicable to the private sector as well, not just government projects.
Oh yes, definitely.
As of now, it's limited just to government projects which are funded through the Capital Works Fund.
So, Fredo, I have a question. So in current framework, if I happen to own a graded building, be it grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and I decided to demolish it, do I have to go through any like these assessment before I can just demolish it? Or
No.
Not really.
So writing a letter to AMO would not work either?
I think interested members of the public can actually write to the AMO and then request for maybe a second assessment when it comes to situations like these. And this happens quite often, in fact. And which is why the AAB would be convened for these emergency meetings to sometimes look at some of these buildings, taking a second look. So for instances such as we have like certain grade 1 buildings, because for most people, I think don't realize that those buildings which are actually on the grade 1 list are potential declared monuments. So if one of these grade 1 buildings are subject to undergo demolition, and if this is brought up to the attention to the AMO by the general public, then certainly AMO and AAB will convene and then to take a second look at that particular building to see that whether it can be actually, if there's actually sufficient grounds to elevate it to the status of proposed declared monument.
How long does that take? Meaning, like, I'm really worried, I really like this building. All of a sudden, I saw this bulldozer. I'm not as brave as the lady in red. Then I quickly type a letter to AMO, and then how long does it take for AMO to actually react and then stop the demolition?
I think for Bishop's Hill, it probably is safe. So probably we don't need to worry about this. And it's other buildings that are of a lesser sort of perceived importance that that are going to be endangered, I think. So I don't think you need to worry, Faith, about this. About
I'm more talking about what about the other buildings?
Yeah, no, I'm also very worried about other buildings in, say, grade 2 or grade 3. And when I was in AAB, we have already started talking about having some legislation for the protection of the graded buildings. And that was at least 6-7 years ago. They still have not done anything on that. And I think we really need to hurry up on this to look at grading very seriously, as well as to put a legislative framework for protecting graded buildings.
I'll just have to say, unfortunately, in Hong Kong, property rights are what matters.
Yeah, that's
what everyone cares about. And if you told someone they had a grade 1, 2, or 3 building and that they couldn't tear it down and develop it, you would be taking away their property rights.
Yes, but that what I was told was enshrined in the basic law.
Yeah, so property rights are key. That's what matters.
Okay, now I have a better understanding. So maybe since we're overrunning by 20 minutes, let's take the very, very, very last question. Let's see. Okay. This one is a very practical one. So Helen Tinsley asked that Paul Zimmerman recently highlighted to local residents of Lam Aqueduct system, 16 of 32 aqueducts identified and reported to AAB. So any advice on how to proceed, since we have so many experts here? Maybe anybody want to respond to this question, like how to proceed with preserving or attempt to preserve this Lam Aqueduct system?
I think the Lam Aqueduct system is part of the Lam Reservoir. I think what the reservoir is now is not in, I would say, in active use. Mm-hmm. So the kind of things is that we can do some kind of assessment on all the structures, gradings, and everything. And if possible, maybe there's a way that because Lam Reservoir is a very popular tourist spot. So I think we can convert it very much like that, like the Thai Reservoir, to make a kind of a system linking up all the aqueducts and everything and surrounding. Maybe even think about including it in the Aberdeen reservoirs. The whole system we can be thinking about how we're going to make it a kind of tourist attraction as well as a kind of heritage. And there can be other elements that we can add into it, like maybe we can even think about making it a kind of a water sports center together with a kind of cafe and everything, make it like a water park. That may be a way that we can go forward. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Lee. So time is running out, really, but I'm really enjoying this discussion with you guys, and I believe all our audience are enjoying this as well. And this discussion about conservation in Hong Kong should not stop here. And our audience, if you have any comments, additional comments or questions, please feel free to leave it on our Facebook comment box. And once this event is done, we'll leave the video recording on the Facebook so you can continue to discuss and comment. And so before we end this discussion, I'd like to thank all our speakers and discussion panelists, Fredo, Jennifer, John, CM, Marc, and Shita, and of course, Professor Ho joining us. and David in helping us organizing this with ICE HKA, as well as the support of Hong Kong Icon. Last but not least, let me steal a couple minutes to make some promotion of our coming events. Let's see, okay. So, okay. So coming next, we have the AIA Hong Kong Mentorship Program 2021. So this is a brand new program that we're promoting this year. We're starting this year. And now we're looking for mentors who are either AIA full member or associate member. And members from different career paths are all welcome. You don't have to be like working in a architecture firm. You can be working in a boutique design firm, working on multidisciplinary projects. You could be entrepreneurs doing product design. You could be, of course, architect working in medium-sized firm or international corporate firm. If you're interested, please do email your information to us at info@aiahongkong.org. And for mentees, we're looking for all architecture students, both bachelor and master of architecture. And if you're interested in being one of the mentees participating in this mentorship program, please follow us on our Instagram at AIA Hong Kong Chapter. That's where we'll release our latest mentorship program announcement. And the next program that we have this year is going to be Archicad learning experience. So we'll have this free workshop for all our members, which is called Initiative BIM for Architects. And you're welcome to sign up at our Facebook page, AIA Hong Kong Chapter. And this concludes our event tonight. I hope you enjoy it and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, everyone.